So every year, the last Sunday before we begin our Advent journey towards the coming of Christ at Christmas, we do this weird thing in the church. We dress the church in white one last time, and we throw on the triumphant hymns. Colin, I've heard word we might have the stops pulled on the trumpets this morning. Good and triumphant and victorious. And we take a Sunday to remind ourselves that Christ is King. So today is the Feast of the Reign of Christ, or if you like, Christ the King Sunday. And I know what you're thinking. That's not really something we need to be reminded of, is it? Our liturgies and our hymns and our scriptures are so steeped in this idea. I did say it was weird. I suppose on the one hand, it's a way of reminding ourselves just what it is we're anticipating as we prepare to make our journey towards the manger. God comes to us. But what kind of God? What will this God-man be like? Well, we say he will be a king. Of course, this is part of the story of the people of Israel in Scripture, that they have been long awaiting the Messiah, and Jesus arrives into their midst to answer their longing. And that's what we do this last Sunday before Advent. We elbow each other in the ribs and say, look, he's on his way. The King is coming. Keep watch. We confess that, as Paul put it in our reading this morning from Colossians, all thrones and dominions and rulers and powers, all things have been created through him and for him. Sometimes we need that reminder, don't we? Sometimes we need to reclaim the hope that no matter the state of the world or the weight of our own lives, Christ remains Lord over it all. But I think there's something more important for us still in this special Sunday. Because what we really need is not just a king, but a particular kind of king. A king unlike the kinds of kings and rulers and heads of state that we're used to in the world. We need to constantly shake the dust off of our stale preconceptions of who God is and what God is like, and be ready to be surprised again. Because without that, we might just miss Christ's coming when he arrives. We might just miss what it actually means that the King arrives into our midst as Emmanuel, God with us. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We are not in Advent yet, much less in Christmas, even if we have a terrible tendency to drag Christmas forward a few weeks and start the celebrations early. Because the story we have in our gospel today has nothing of the sentimentality of Advent or the quiet, hopeful longing toward Christmas. Instead, as we remember and rehearse the kingship of Christ, our gospel today shocks us with the stark image of Christ's greatest defeat in all its gory detail. The moment in which Christ looks least like a king. So I want to ask this morning, why of all the stories that we could tell on this Sunday, is this the one that we choose to tell? I mean, it's strange, isn't it? Because it's not like we don't have plenty of other stories in the Gospels to work with that might fit this kingly theme a little bit better. We could have Palm Sunday, Jesus coming into Jerusalem triumphantly on the donkey. Or we could have the Transfiguration on the mountain where Jesus' face turns dazzling like the sun and he chats it up with Moses and Elijah. Or we could have the resurrection itself, or the ascension, or any of the other grand moments in which Christ is unveiled in his glory. But what we get instead is Luke's telling of the crucifixion narrative. So let's have a look at this. On the one hand, the way that Luke tells this story is saturated with the imagery of kings and royalty. It reads like a satire on those things. Just before today's reading, Luke recounts the soldiers draping Jesus in a royal purple robe, and they put a crown of twisted thorns on his head, as if to say, look, Israel, is this your king? And then the gospel today opens with Christ nailed to the cross. lifted up above the people. It's pretty clear that for Luke, this is a picture of Christ on his throne. And that's driven home by the two criminals on his right and on his left in the places of honor, either side of this unexpected throne. The soldiers and the crowd jeer at Jesus, calling him the Messiah and the Chosen One. These are titles with deep roots in the Jewish imagination, recalling the great kings of Israel like David and Solomon. Even Luke's description of the crowd hints at this theme. He talks about the leaders at the foot of the cross who scoff at Christ. In Greek, that word leader is the same word for ruler. Luke's pitting these two competing visions of rulership against one another. And then, just in case we somehow missed the whole point, there's a sign over Jesus' head that reads, "This is the King of the Jews." So on the one hand, the story is saturated with the imagery of kingship. But on the other hand, that imagery is all just wretched irony. Sarcastic robes, sadistic crowns, all the hopes of the people amounting to Jesus dying in the place of dishonor between two good-for-nothings. So why, when we come to rehearse and remind ourselves of the kingship of Christ, why do we tell the story of Christ at his most defeated? I think we struggle to understand this because we're so deeply coded by another vision of what triumph and victory looks like. We call it the hero's journey. You know it, even if you don't know you know it, because it's rehashed in every single Hollywood epic and superhero movie. It's the narrative that says that defeat always ultimately gives way to victory. I mean, we love a comeback story, don't we? So Gandalf dies defeating the evil Balrog, but he comes back stronger later. Luke Skywalker is beaten and has his hand lopped off by Darth Vader, but he goes away and trains harder only to come back and win the war in the end. And if you'd like further nerdy examples, speak to me afterwards. I've got tons of them. This is the arc of the hero's journey that we've come to expect. Initial triumph, followed by failure and defeat that gives way to final redemption in the end. And if we're not careful, we can mistake Jesus' story for that kind of arc. His quiet coming at Christmas, his seeming defeat on the cross, and his triumphant comeback moment at Easter. But that isn't how the Gospels tell the story at all. Actually, the vision of the heroic, victorious Messiah that the people of Israel were always looking toward finds its culmination not in an act of triumph, but right here on the cross, in the ultimate act of defeat. The biblical narrative wants to make absolutely clear that this, the consummation of the whole story, isn't just a momentary defeat, it's the moment of triumph itself. This is Christ's kingdom. This moment, in all its grotesque irony, this is Christ, revealed as King. And this is the inbreaking of Christ's kingdom in real time. Now, I know this sounds a bit theologically pedantic, and many of you know I'm given over to a bit of theological pedantry, but actually I think this is really important. Without it, we miss something really fundamental about the particular story that we tell as Christian people. Luke drives this home in his account of the crucifixion, where we get this really peculiar little exchange at the end of the gospel reading this morning. We hear from Luke that one of the criminals derides Jesus, and then the other comes to his defense and says, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." He's looking toward that future day of resurrection, or going to heaven, or whatever else you want to call it, when everything will be redeemed. It's the hero's journey, a hope that death is momentary but ultimately gives way to life. And Jesus says to him, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." Today. Now, it seems on the surface that Jesus is saying, "I'll see you in heaven in a few minutes." But it's never been the belief of the church that Christ went to heaven when he died. That comes later with the ascension. And the early church to whom Luke is writing certainly didn't believe that. So why is Jesus evoking the idea of paradise here? I think this starts to make much more sense for us when we start to understand the cross not as the place of defeat, but as the inbreaking of the kingdom in its glory. This is Christ's kingdom, and this repentant criminal is the first one to enter it. These two criminals in the seats of honor or dishonor either side of Christ, the theologian Karl Barth called these guys the first Christian community. As Barth says, great things had to pass before Peter and the rest of the disciples joined this first Christian community. And when they did so, they could only get in line behind the two criminals who were already first and up there in front with Jesus on Golgotha. It seems fitting to me that the first one to dance his way into Christ's upside-down kingdom would be a scoundrel and a society reject. This is why we need to remind ourselves again and again, not just that Christ is king, but that Christ is a completely different kind of king to the ones that we've come to expect. We need that reminder because it has something really important to say about the ways of being in the world that we pursue as Christian people. One thing it means is that there is absolutely no place for triumphalism in the church. It means that the pursuit of a strong, muscular Christianity, a Christianity that pursues the way of might is right, is an aberration of the real thing. Because Christians have never been in the business of winning, but only in the business of faithful witness. It means that to win over one's enemies isn't to beat them down or villainize them, but to make peace from the place of our defeat and to pray, Father, forgive them. Into our broken world and its broken systems, into our broken lives, we need a different kind of king. This is why the last Sunday, before we begin our Advent journey, we take a moment to remind ourselves of the one who is coming to us. One who will not assert himself or lord it over us, but takes the form of loving and self-emptying service. To call Christ King is to say that he is source and final authority over all other authorities. And we need that, don't we? Desperately. We need to not shy away from the confidence that is ours in Christ. The confidence that says, this is what I believe. This is where I stand. But to say that this king is Christ crucified is to say that this authority doesn't assert itself over us, but rather, as Paul put it, comes to reconcile all things, whether on earth or in heaven, by making peace through Christ's blood shed on the cross. It is power exercised in peacemaking, rule that gives itself to the cause of reconciliation. This is the particular kind of king after which we at Christ Church are named, and the kind of kingdom that we seek to live out in the world. May Christ embolden us with courage and confidence to proclaim a different kingdom and a different king, whose coming heralds healing, forgiveness, reconciliation, and peace. Thanks be to God.